Today, Special Counsel Jack Smith is expected to submit evidence in the criminal election interference case against former President Donald Trump.
Jack Smith's attorneys writing this, quote, given the many mischaracterizations of Mr. Smith's investigation into President Trump's alleged mishandling of classified documents and his role in attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election, Mr. Smith respectfully requests the opportunity to testify in open hearings before the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. Jack Smith's team added just one caveat, quote, he's prepared to answer questions about the special counsel's investigation and prosecution, but he requires assurance from the Department of Justice that he will not be punished for doing so. Jack Smith is making this offer to testify in full view publicly because and after Republicans have alleged for weeks now that Jack Smith's team unlawfully tapped the phone records of members of Special Counsel Jack Smith is telling Republicans, game on. In a letter just released from his attorneys to Congressman Jim Jordan and Senator Chuck Grassley, the chairs of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee, Jack Smith is offering to testify, but he wants to do so in a public hearing about the investigations he conducted.
I need you to understand something about what Jack Smith did before he walked out the door at the Department of Justice, because it is probably the most devastating legal document ever written about a sitting American president, and Donald Trump's lawyers are still trying to figure out how to make it go away, even though the criminal cases have already been dismissed. We are talking about a 165-page legal brief that dropped like a bomb on Trump's immunity claims back in October 2024, followed by a 170-page final report released in January 2025 that basically told the American people, yes, we have more than enough evidence to convict him on multiple felonies, but you voted him back into office, so here we are stuck with a situation where justice cannot be served. These documents lay out in absolutely excruciating detail exactly what Trump did before and during the January 6th attack on the Capitol building. They include brand new witness testimony that the public had never seen before, private conversations that directly contradict everything Trump said publicly about the election, phone records from that day showing exactly what Trump was doing while the Capitol was under siege, and a blow-by-blow timeline of how the former president allegedly conspired to steal an election he knew he had lost fair and square. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
Smith and prosecutors have until 5 p.m. Eastern time to file the extensive dossier to the federal judge. It may contain new evidence connected to Donald Trump's alleged efforts to overturn the 2020 election.
And here's the thing that makes this whole situation so remarkable. Even though the criminal cases got dismissed because you simply cannot prosecute a sitting president under Department of Justice policy, these filings are now permanently part of the public record, which is exactly why Trump and his legal team fought so incredibly hard to bury them, and why they are still absolutely panicking about what they reveal to anyone who takes the time to read them. Jack Smith knew from the moment Trump won the 2024 election that the criminal prosecutions were basically finished. The long-standing DOJ policy says you cannot bring charges against a sitting president, and there is no way around that rule, no matter how strong your evidence might be. So Smith did something that drives Trump absolutely insane to this day. He made sure the evidence would outlive the criminal cases themselves. He filed that massive 165-page immunity brief in October 2024, laying out his entire case against Trump in unprecedented detail. And then he submitted a final report in January 2025, right before Trump took office, that essentially said, we had him dead to rights, and he would have been convicted on every charge if voters had not given him a get-out-of-jail-free card by electing him again. Trump called Smith a lame-brained prosecutor and complained bitterly that the final report was released at 1 a.m. like some kind of sneak attack. But here is the thing Trump knows but does not want to admit publicly. He understands exactly what those documents contain because he has been fighting desperately to keep them secret since the day they were written, and now that they are permanently public, he cannot unring that bell no matter how many times he screams about witch hunts and hoaxes and election interference on Truth Social. The immunity brief is particularly damaging to Trump's narrative because it walks through exactly how Smith's team planned to prove that Trump's actions around January 6th were not protected by the broad presidential immunity the Supreme Court created. Remember, the conservative majority on the Supreme Court handed Trump an absolutely enormous gift last summer when they ruled that presidents enjoy broad immunity for official acts committed while in office. Trump's lawyers immediately jumped on that ruling and argued that everything he did to try to overturn the election was an official presidential act, and therefore he could not be prosecuted for any of it under the new immunity framework. Jack Smith's response to that argument was basically, nice try, but absolutely not. He argued persuasively that Trump was acting as a political candidate trying to steal an election he lost, not as a president carrying out his legitimate constitutional duties. The immunity brief lays out in devastating and meticulous detail how Trump used private lawyers outside the government, campaign infrastructure and staff, and personal relationships to execute his scheme to stay in power illegally. It describes multiple conversations where Trump was told point blank by his own advisors that his fraud claims were complete garbage with no evidentiary support, and his response was essentially, who cares about the facts? The details do not matter anyway. That is not a president faithfully executing the laws of the United States as the Constitution requires. That is a con man trying to hold on to power by any means necessary, and the actual facts of the election were completely irrelevant to his strategy. And the pressure campaign on Mike Pence, come on, the stuff in these documents about what Trump did to his own loyal vice president is absolutely wild and should concern every American, regardless of their political affiliation. According to Smith's detailed filing, Trump called Pence on January 1st, 2021, and told him that hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts and people are going to think you are stupid if Pence refused to help Trump overturn the election results during the certification process. Trump allegedly called his own vice president too honest, as if basic integrity and following the Constitution were somehow character flaws that Pence needed to overcome. Let me take you through exactly what these filings contain, because the level of detail that Jack Smith compiled is genuinely shocking, and it explains completely why Trump has been so desperate to keep them buried from public view since they were first written. The 165-page immunity brief that Judge Tanya Chutkan unsealed back in October 2024 was Jack Smith's attempt to salvage his prosecution after the Supreme Court's devastating immunity ruling completely changed the legal landscape. The High Court said presidents enjoy absolute immunity for core constitutional powers and presumptive immunity for other official acts performed while in office. That ruling meant Smith had to prove conclusively that everything Trump did to overturn the election was unofficial conduct, meaning it was campaign activity and candidate behavior rather than legitimate presidential duty. So Smith went through the entire alleged scheme piece by piece with painstaking detail and showed systematically how Trump operated as a candidate trying to steal an election, not as a commander-in-chief, faithfully executing his constitutional responsibilities. The brief starts by laying out Smith's theory of the case in the starkest and most direct possible terms. When the defendant lost the 2020 presidential election, he resorted to crimes to try to stay in office. That is a direct quote from the actual filing that anyone can read for themselves. Smith argued that at its core, Trump's scheme was fundamentally a private one because he extensively used private actors outside the government and his campaign infrastructure to attempt to overturn the election results and operated in a private capacity as a candidate for office rather than as president. This framing was absolutely crucial to Smith's legal strategy because it directly attacked Trump's immunity defense at its foundation. If Trump was acting as a candidate rather than as the sitting president when he did these things, then the Supreme Court's immunity ruling simply does not protect him, and he can still potentially be prosecuted for everything he did to overturn the election. Trump's lawyers immediately understood exactly how dangerous this legal argument was to their client, which is why they fought tooth and nail to keep the brief completely sealed from public view and then demanded extra time and extra pages to respond once it became public anyway. The evidence Smith compiled about Trump's actual state of mind is particularly devastating to Trump's defense because it shows conclusively that Trump knew his fraud claims were completely false but kept pushing them publicly anyway because they served his political purpose. According to the detailed filing, a White House staffer overheard Trump tell his daughter Ivanka and son-in-law Jared Kushner that it does not matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell regardless of the actual outcome. Stop and think about what that statement really means for a moment. Trump was not telling his own family members that he genuinely believed the election was stolen from him. He was explicitly saying it did not matter whether he actually won or lost the election. The fight itself was the entire point of the exercise. The chaos and confusion were the point. Staying in power by any means necessary was the real objective, and the actual facts about who legitimately won the election were completely and utterly irrelevant to Trump's strategy. Another devastating conversation described in Smith's brief involves a White House staffer telling Trump directly that his private attorney, identified in court documents as co-conspirator 1, who we know from other reporting is Rudy Giuliani, would never be able to prove his fraud claims if they were actually challenged in a court of law. Trump's response, according to prosecutors, was simply the details do not matter. That statement alone is consciousness of guilt in its purest form. That is a criminal defendant who knows full well that his public statements are lies, but does not care at all because the lies are serving his political purpose of staying in power. Legal experts who reviewed the filing called this evidence absolutely damning because it shows Trump was not mistaken or misinformed about the election. He simply did not care whether his claims were true because the truth was irrelevant to his strategy. The Mike Pence material is where Smith's brief really becomes genuinely explosive because it shows Trump systematically and relentlessly pressuring his own loyal vice president to help overturn the election, despite being told repeatedly and clearly that Pence had absolutely no legal authority to do what Trump was demanding. According to Smith's detailed filing, Trump and his personal lawyers developed a coordinated plan to manipulate Pence into either outright rejecting Biden's legitimate electoral votes or at minimum delaying the certification process on January 6th to create more chaos and confusion. The people pushing this plan knew it was legally dubious at best and probably unconstitutional. John Eastman, the law professor who came up with the entire scheme, had previously written in his own legal analysis that it was not within the vice president's constitutional authority to reject electoral votes on his own. Eastman even acknowledged in private communications with other conspirators that the risk of getting a court ruling that Pence has no authority to reject the Biden certified ballots was very high. But they pushed forward with the pressure campaign anyway because keeping Trump in power was apparently more important than following the law or respecting the Constitution. The phone call Trump made to Pence on January 1st, 2021 is particularly chilling when you read the details in Smith's filing. According to the brief, Trump verbally attacked his own vice president after Pence filed a court brief opposing a lawsuit that would have legally forced Pence to help overturn the election results. Trump allegedly told Pence during that call that hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts if he did not go along with the scheme, and that people are going to think you are stupid for following the law instead of helping Trump stay in power. Trump reportedly called Pence too honest, treating basic integrity and respect for the Constitution as some kind of embarrassing character flaw that Pence needed to overcome to be a real team player. Legal analyst Neil Cattell explained what Smith was really arguing with all of this devastating evidence about the Pence pressure campaign. When Trump did all this stuff, like pressuring Pence to violate his constitutional oath, that was not part of any presidential power in Article 2 of the Constitution. That was just a guy who desperately wanted to keep his job and was willing to break any rule to do it. The private pressure campaign on Pence was purely candidate behavior, not legitimate presidential conduct, which means it falls completely outside the immunity protection the Supreme Court created in its ruling. Smith's final report, released to the public in January 2025, just days before Trump's inauguration, goes even further in laying out the complete case that would have been presented to a jury at trial if the prosecution had been allowed to proceed. The 170-page document includes Smith's blunt conclusion that the admissible evidence his team compiled was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial, but for Trump's election victory and imminent return to the presidency. In other words, career prosecutors at the Department of Justice believed they had an absolutely slam dunk case against Donald Trump, and he only escaped justice because American voters decided to give him another term in office despite knowing he had been indicted on serious federal charges. Smith strongly defended his decision to bring the charges in the first place, writing that to have done otherwise on the facts developed during our work would have been to shirk my duties as a prosecutor and a public servant. He added that after nearly 30 years of public service in law enforcement, that was a choice he simply could not abide. Trump's repeated claims that Smith's prosecutorial decisions were somehow influenced or directed by the Biden administration for political purposes were, in Smith's own words, in a word, laughable. The final report also revealed important new details about how Trump's alleged co-conspirators knew their fraud claims were completely baseless, even while they were pushing them publicly. According to Smith's investigation, prosecutors obtained encrypted signal messages where Jeffrey Clark, former DOJ official who tried to use his position to help Trump overturn the election, sent a message to Congressman Scott Perry saying he had received a highly classified intelligence briefing on potential foreign interference in the 2020 election, and that briefing yielded absolutely nothing to support allegations of a stolen election. Clark's message reportedly said the bottom line is there is nothing helpful to P, with P clearly meaning President Trump. So Trump's own closest allies and co-conspirators were privately admitting among themselves that they had no actual evidence of fraud while simultaneously telling the American public that the election had been stolen. That is textbook fraud and conspiracy, and now it is all permanently part of the public record, thanks to Jack Smith's determination to document exactly what happened, even if he could not ultimately prosecute it in a court of law. Let me break down why these documents matter so much, even though the criminal cases are effectively dead, because I think a lot of people are completely missing the bigger picture of what Jack Smith actually accomplished here before he resigned from the Department of Justice. Yes, Donald Trump is not going to prison for January 6th, at least not during this presidential term, while he enjoys the protection of DOJ policy against prosecuting sitting presidents. The Supreme Court's immunity ruling, combined with his election victory in November 2024, means he essentially ran out the clock on federal prosecution by delaying the cases long enough to win back the presidency. But Smith clearly understood from the beginning that the evidence itself has enormous value beyond any criminal conviction that might result from a trial. By filing that massive immunity brief and then releasing his comprehensive final report before leaving office, he created a permanent public record of exactly what federal investigators found during years of painstaking work. Future prosecutors, future historians, future Congresses, and future voters now have complete access to witness testimony and documentary evidence that would have been presented at trial if the case had ever reached a jury. Trump cannot make that evidence disappear, no matter how much he complains about it on social media, and that reality is driving his legal team absolutely crazy because they understand the long-term implications. Think carefully about what the American public now knows because of these filings that they would not know otherwise. We know from witness testimony that Trump was told repeatedly by his own senior advisors that his fraud claims were demonstrably false, and he pushed them aggressively anyway because they served his political purpose. We know that Trump's private attorney admitted the fraud claims would never hold up if challenged in any legitimate court of law, and Trump's response was that the details do not matter because the truth was irrelevant to his strategy. We know that Trump pressured Mike Pence relentlessly with explicit threats about his political future and personal reputation if he refused to help overturn the election results. We know from encrypted messages that Trump's co-conspirators privately acknowledged among themselves that there was absolutely no evidence of foreign election interference while they were publicly claiming the opposite to the American people. We know that Smith's team conducted voluntary interviews with more than 250 individual witnesses and presented grand jury testimony from over 55 different people. We know that career prosecutors at the Department of Justice with decades of experience believed the evidence was more than strong enough to obtain a conviction from any fair jury. All of that critically important information is now permanently embedded in the historical record of this period, and it paints a devastating picture of a president who tried to steal an election he knew he lost through fraud, illegal pressure campaigns, and ultimately mob violence directed at the United States Capitol. The political implications of these filings are genuinely significant heading into the future, and Republicans should be paying close attention. Trump has spent years claiming loudly that he was the innocent victim of a weaponized Justice Department conducting a political witch hunt prosecution designed to prevent him from winning back the presidency. But Smith's detailed filings tell a very different and far more damning story, one where Trump and his closest allies knowingly and deliberately lied to the American people about widespread election fraud, pressured state election officials, and the sitting vice president to help overturn completely legitimate election results, orchestrated a fake elector scheme to create false documents, and then sat back in the White House watching television while a violent mob attacked the Capitol building and threatened to hang Mike Pence. Polling consistently shows that Americans can distinguish between legitimate law enforcement investigations and political revenge prosecutions, and majorities have concluded that the January 6th prosecution fell into the legitimate category, while Trump's revenge prosecutions of people like James Comey and Letitia James do not. That is a significant problem for Trump's narrative because it undermines his entire claim of persecution and victimhood. The filings also create very real potential legal exposure for Trump once he finally leaves office after this term ends in January 2029. The federal statute of limitations on some of these alleged crimes will still be running when Trump is no longer protected by presidential immunity and DOJ policy against prosecuting sitting presidents. A future Department of Justice under a different administration could theoretically pick up exactly where Smith left off, using the extensive evidence he compiled over years of investigation to bring new criminal charges against a former president who is no longer shielded by the protections he currently enjoys. Trump's lawyers absolutely understand this possibility and the serious risk it represents, which is precisely why they fought so desperately hard to prevent the release of Smith's final report, and why they are now working overtime to discredit everything he found and delegitimize the entire investigation in the public mind. The vicious personal attacks on Smith himself, calling him a lame-brained prosecutor, accusing him of election interference, issuing executive orders targeting the law firm that provided him with pro bono legal assistance during his transition out of government, are all clearly part of a coordinated strategy to delegitimize the investigation before it can potentially be used against Trump again in the future. There is also the serious question of what these detailed documents mean for Trump's alleged co-conspirators who do not enjoy the same protections Trump has as a sitting president. Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Jeffrey Clark, and several others were specifically identified in Smith's filings as active participants in the scheme to overturn the 2020 election results. While Trump himself is currently protected from federal prosecution, some of these individuals may not be and could still face serious legal consequences. Giuliani has already been disbarred in multiple states and faces massive civil judgments, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars from defamation lawsuits. John Eastman was also disbarred after disciplinary proceedings found he violated his professional obligations. Jeffrey Clark faced his own disciplinary proceedings for his conduct. The extremely detailed descriptions of their alleged criminal conduct in Smith's immunity brief and final report create a comprehensive roadmap for any prosecutor at the state or federal level who wants to hold these individuals accountable for their roles in the conspiracy. And then there's the historical significance of what Jack Smith documented during his investigation that will outlast all of the current political battles. Presidential scandals live or die in public memory, based largely on the evidentiary record they leave behind for historians and future generations to examine. Watergate is remembered so vividly decades later because of the devastating tapes and the compelling testimony that emerged during congressional investigations and the special prosecutor's work. The evidence compiled during Watergate outlasted Nixon's presidency and fundamentally shaped how Americans understood what happened for generations afterward. Jack Smith clearly understood from the beginning that his filings would serve a very similar function for January 6th and the attempted coup. Even if Trump never faces a jury for what he did, the evidence Smith compiled over years of work will inform how historians write about this period in American history. It will shape how future generations understand exactly what happened in the chaotic weeks between the 2020 election and the violent attack on the Capitol. It will provide essential context for ongoing debates about presidential power, democratic norms, and the rule of law that will continue long after Trump leaves the political stage for good. Former federal prosecutor Andrew Weissman, who served as a lead attorney on the Mueller investigation into Russian interference, described Smith's immunity brief as delivering bombshell after bombshell and compared the revelations to the Watergate evidence that brought down Richard Nixon. Barbara McQuaid, another highly respected former federal prosecutor, says she was particularly struck by the strength of the corroborating evidence Smith assembled from so many independent sources. These are not partisan political commentators looking to score points. These are career prosecutors with decades of experience who understand exactly what it takes to build a successful criminal case and who recognized immediately that Smith had done precisely that. The unfortunate fact that Trump escaped prosecution through strategic delay tactics and an electoral victory does not change the quality of the evidence Smith compiled or the seriousness of the alleged criminal conduct he documented. It just means that accountability, if it ever comes for Donald Trump, will have to wait until he leaves office again, and the evidence will be there waiting for whoever wants to pursue justice. Trump clearly understands the serious threat these documents pose to his historical legacy and his future legal exposure once he leaves office. That is exactly why he attacked Jack Smith so viciously after the final report was released to the public. That is why he issued executive orders targeting the law firm that provided Smith with legal assistance during his transition. That is why his closest allies in Congress have spent months trying to reframe the January 6th investigation as nothing more than political persecution rather than legitimate law enforcement. But the evidence speaks for itself, and now that it is permanently public, millions of Americans can read it and reach their own conclusions about what Trump actually did. Jack Smith may not have gotten his trial, but he got something almost as valuable. He got the truth into the permanent historical record where Donald Trump cannot touch it or make it disappear. And that is exactly why Trump's team is still panicking about what these filings reveal. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you want to stay on top of all the legal and political developments coming out of Washington. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what Jack Smith actually found during his investigation, and I will see you in the next one.